Committee will now come to order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on items not on today's agenda? Seeing none, let us go to the first item. Which of you is presenting?
I'll be presenting the revenues for mid-year financial review. Julie will follow with all the appropriation and expenditure data for the first 6 months through December 31st, 2013.
Thank you.
So overall, the first slide reflects your tax revenues for the city for the first 6 months of the year. General fund revenues appear to be trending as expected overall. Taxes as well are slightly below, but that's basically in part that we don't receive those taxes evenly throughout the year. So on a comparison basis, we look at 3-year benchmark averages at this point in time, and as you can see, that the total taxes are at 44% overall as compared to the three-year average benchmark of 43%. Sales tax is actually slightly below our budget estimates. We do anticipate ending the year at close to $270,000 below our budget estimates. We built that number based on prior years, and last year's numbers came in slightly lower. So we anticipate coming in just slightly lower than budget on a projected basis. In property tax, we are trending higher than budget. Based on county data, however, we'll see that number increase at the end of the year to be over budget by about $780,000, and that's primarily due to increased assessed valuations. Based on county data, they demonstrate about a 4%, about 4.3% increase in assessed valuations, and originally our budgets were set with a 2% increase to property values. The UUT is trending as expected and in line. TOT, although it's slightly lower, just under $10,000 on a year-to-date basis through December, we do anticipate that TOT revenue will be coming in at the end of the year. I believe right now our numbers are showing at about $164,000 at the end of the year, above budget. Again, business license is also trending slightly higher. That may be due to a timing difference. This year we did send out the renewals for business license earlier in December, and that was in the November timeframe. So basically had renewals earlier this year than last year. Last year, the bulk of the renewals happened in January. Next one. In this category, you'll see that fines and forfeitures are trending, as well as franchise fees in line with budget. I'll talk a little bit about intergovernmental revenues are quite a bit higher on a year-to-date basis. That's primarily due to fire department mutual aid reimbursements. A significant number of those dollars, I believe it's about $800,000 was received on a reimbursement for mutual aid. Fire had budgeted that at closer to $400,000.
Okay. That had me worried for a moment.
Okay. And then overall miscellaneous, that's the annual budget for miscellaneous category is $9 million. The next slide breaks that number down to a few different categories. As you can see, the largest category is indirect allocations. These at about $6 million. Indirect allocations represent the reimbursements for administrative services and overhead to other departments, and of course that's at 50%. We allocate that cost quarterly, so through the year that's 50%. Operating transfers in, those are revenues that represent items such as the revenues from Water Park for parks maintenance reimbursement, street sweeping revenues for police enforcement, payments from Downtown Association for downtown streets and maintenance, and traffic safety funds for police operations. The last slide are our fees and service charges. These are the various fees the departments charge for services. Overall, we're at about 50%. Two departments are running a little lower than their year-to-date budget, and that's community development. Again, that's based on community development activity, building activity, which is slightly lower than anticipated. Parks and recreation, is slightly lower than anticipated, but a little higher than last year same time. Park and Rec revenues tend to be seasonal, whereby most of the revenues received in the summer. So we'd anticipate in the fourth quarter this fiscal year that those funds would be coming in for all the summer activities. And that's general fund revenues. I'm available for any questions if you have them.
Mr. White, any questions? Please continue.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco, Committee Member White. I'm Julie Nemus. I'm the Accounting Manager from the Finance Department. I'm going to be talking about general fund expenditures as well as enterprise funds and proposed budget adjustments. First, I'm going to be talking about the general fund expenditures. I'm going to be focusing on 3 columns. First is the adjusted annual budget. Second is the year-to-date budget, and this is adjusted for seasonality. And third is the variance without encumbrances. I'm going to be looking at all of the significant variances. There's about a handful, I'd say about 4 or 5 that I'm going to focus on, primarily the very large variances or the negative variances. The first one is police. Police is coming in about $194,000 over budget at 12/31. This is largely due to overtime. In the past, police has had a lot of vacancies that have been able to offset this overtime. Whereas during the current fiscal year, they're largely operating at full staffing, so they don't have as many vacancies to offset this overtime. Police is going to be closely monitoring these overtime costs and to see if at third quarter potentially they need to do some cost reductions or even come back at third quarter and request some additional appropriations. The next is fire. This is almost completely due to mutual aid activities. We discussed this a little bit at first quarter. This over expenditure is completely offset by additional mutual aid revenues. Library, I'm just going to briefly discuss this. This is really kind of across the board additional services and supplies, but library is still coming in under 50% at mid-year, and they're expected to come in under budget at year end. Next is community development. This is really a difference in timing. It's a timing difference in some payments as well as some salary savings from a leave of absence and some hourly vacancies, as well as some across-the-board salary savings in services and supplies. They're projected to have some savings at year end, but we'll know a little bit more at third quarter. And last is community promotion. This is almost entirely due to a timing difference in a payment to Santa Barbara Conference and Visitors Bureau and Film Commission for promoting tourism for the city. The third quarter payment is usually made in January, whereas for this year it was made in January, whereas last year it was made in December. So there was a timing difference.
Okay.
Any questions before I move on?
Mr. White?
I'd appreciate hearing a little more about the police overtime, just how that is happening and what might be done to...
Sure, I think I'd ask Lori to come up from police and talk a little bit about that.
Lori Peterson.
To be more specific in my question, I would think that to the extent that there are more officers now on the payroll, that they could be used to be staffing those times when overtime might need it. And so straighten me out on that.
Okay. Lori Peterson, Business Manager, Police Department. The challenge with the police department overall is that we use a balancing strategy between the salaries that are budgeted and the overtime that is budgeted. And as positions are vacant and then filled, the salary and overtime occurs as well. So we balance between the actual expenditures for salaries and then the savings from vacancies. Although we are trending to a fuller staff level, we still anticipate that at year end we will be able to match those out, just in a timing issue.
And then on the cost, what is the cost of an officer on overtime? How does that compare to the cost of an officer just straight employment?
Well, and for this is department-wide, so the overtime isn't just purely officer time. It's also record staff and hourly, or not hourly, but record staff and staff that is not an officer position. So that's where we're balancing that. The difference in money value between the actual salary and overtime. I don't have that on me at the moment.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions before I move on to enterprise funds?
No.
So really quick, overall, the general fund is coming in about $814,000 under budget. So overall, the general fund is looking, it's meeting budget, but police is the one area we'll be closely monitoring. Moving on to enterprise funds, there are quite a few variances that I discuss in the narrative for enterprise funds, but I'm going to focus on the very large variances, mostly the ones that have a higher percentage of year-to-date variance as a percentage of year-to-date budget. Primarily those that are more than 5% is what I focused on. I can answer any questions you have about the other variances, though. So I'm going to be focusing on the same three columns, the annual budget, year-to-date budget, and the year-to-date variance. That's okay. Okay. The first variance I'm going to be focusing on is in the solid waste fund. Solid waste is coming in about $270,000 over budget at 12/31 for expenses. This is primarily due to a timing difference as well. It's for the semi-annual payment of about $273,000 for the regional fees to the county for the waste management services. And in the prior year, the payment was made in January and not December, but this is expected to change and even out over the rest of the year. The next variance I'd like to discuss is for the water fund. The expenses are actually coming in about $3 million under budget. This is also largely a timing difference, both in debt service costs and also in the startup and running costs of the Ortega well. About $1 million was budgeted, but due to a delay in the startup, only about $126,000 was spent as of 12/31. So more costs are expected to be spent in the second half of the year for that startup and running of the Ortega well. In addition, staff at Public Works is expecting to have some additional costs related to the drought. The extent of those costs related to things such as advertising, marketing, potential staffing costs is not known at this time, but staff will potentially come back at third quarter or even on their own to request from council for additional appropriations or maybe even reprogramming of savings in the water fund to drought costs.
Mr. White.
Thank you. So but the Ortega treatment system is now operational and working, or will we? How are we doing on
Chair
that?
Francisco, Committee Member White, Rebecca Bjork, excuse me, Acting Public Works Director. Yes, the well treatment plant is currently online, and we would expect to run it actually at a higher level this spring than we had originally planned and budgeted for. So some of those savings that we were able to experience in the first half of the year, we expect will have additional costs in the second half.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. The next variance I'd like to focus on is in the wastewater fund. The expenses came in about $1.2 million under budget. These are also related to some timing differences. Primarily the state revolving loan fund, there were some delays with the unanticipated delays with the application process. So those payments did not happen in the first half of the year, as well as some conservative budgeting that tends to happen with the wastewater fund. They do conservative budgeting every year. So there's some savings as of 12/31. The next variance I'd like to focus on is the airport fund. Revenues are actually coming in, under budget of about $112,000 at 12/31. This is primarily due to 2 commercial property vacancies. The next variance is about $744,000 of airport expenses are coming in over budget at 12/31. This is largely due to timing differences in how the capital program and how we fund debt in the airport fund. The capital outlay transfers, how those are being, how they're actually being transferred, the timing of the transfers, as well as how the debt program is being funded. In addition, we expect that all to be resolved by the end of the year because they are timing differences, and we're expecting the airport fund to be at budget by year end. The next variance is in the golf fund. It's about $20,000. Expenses are exceeding budget at 12/31. This is almost entirely due to higher water rates, just from increases in water the dry season. And staff has responded to this by actually reprogramming some appropriations related to the turf equipment replacement program. So that will actually offset this additional expenditures in the second half as well. They're planning for higher costs in the second half. Those are all of the variances that I was going to discuss, unless you have any other questions.
Mr. White.
Thank you. One that you did not mention, but you did speak to in your staff report was the downtown parking. And
Sure.
You mentioned the good news that there are fewer retail vacancies in the downtown corridor.
Correct.
Do we have that quantified in any way? And if so, could you kindly pass that information along? Is that something that we have a specific sense of?
Michelle DeCamp from Public Works might be able to give some more information on downtown parking.
Great. I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Any other questions?
Not from me.
All right. I'm going to move on to the proposed budget adjustments. We have quite a few adjustments, so I will try to keep this as short as possible. The first one is in the general fund. Every year we get we get PEG fees from Cox Communication that are allocated to City TV and to TVSB. And this is a request from City TV to allocate or appropriate from reserves for a design firm contract to start for the camera equipment program that they've already been funding for, that they've already requested and put in their capital program and plan. So if you have any additional questions, Tony is here. He can answer some questions on that. No? Okay.
Tony, I have questions.
Okay.
Could you just describe in a little more detail what this is about?
Mr. Chair, Committee Member White, Tony Ruggieri, City TV Production Supervisor. This is for a design contract that will go out to bid for a firm to come in and assess all our video systems, create a transition plan to replace those systems with new equipment. As you know, we have a lot of aging equipment in our control room and these two meeting rooms. So the company will come in, we'll do an assessment, we'll look at what's out there, what kind of equipment's out there, and come up with a plan to replace it. We did budget for this last fiscal, this is the first fiscal year we've been collecting PEG fees for this project. It will probably take us 2 to 3 fiscal years to save up enough PEG fees to do the project, but this is the first step.
Okay.
And we'll be looking at a lot of the equipment we have is old, outdated analog equipment. You can't even buy it anymore. We'll be looking at digital equipment and hopefully be able to upgrade most of our systems to high definition.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Any other questions, Mr. White? Thanks, Tony.
The next recommended or requested adjustment is related to community development. For the fiscal year 14 budget, community development actually requested that the rental housing mediation program be transferred from miscellaneous grants to the general fund. The $64,000 here is what was left in fund balance in miscellaneous grants related to this program. So this request will actually transfer from miscellaneous grants to the general fund, the remaining fund balance, and then allocate that or appropriate that out for hourly salaries to this program. This next set of entries is all related to the police department. The first one is related to animal licensing. In fiscal year 13, the police department did receive about $4,000 in donations and revenues for animal licensing. This fell to fund balance. It wasn't appropriated in the prior year. The request now is to appropriate from reserves, since it dropped to reserves, for clinics related to animal licensing, vaccinations, and spay and neutering clinics. The next set right below that are a series of entries. Lori Peterson, who was up earlier from the business manager from police department, has over the last year spent a lot of time going through all of the grants that police department has, primarily in the miscellaneous grants fund, has done a really good job analyzing them and identifying where all of the revenues and expenditures are for those. And what she's identified is that some of the costs related to the grants that have been received in miscellaneous grants have been spent or expended out of the general fund. And so what this is doing is reimbursing the general fund for costs that were coming out of the general fund when the revenues were received in the miscellaneous grants fund. So there were 3 grants identified: the SaberNet grant, the DUI grant, which was over a 3-year period, and the ABC grant. And it equates to $176,000 for SaberNet, $52,000 for DUI, and $8,000 for ABC. And that will all go to reimburse the general fund. Moving on to the capital outlay fund. The first entry is related to the library. In fiscal year 2011, about $250,000 was programmed for the Central Library Building Reorganization Project, and included in this was moving the children's area. And this entry is actually going to move the remaining appropriations in the project for the project to the Children's Library Project to consolidate the project. It's really an administrative function. It was available remaining appropriations to be able to do all of the children's reorganization into one project so that they're not having expenditures out of 2 separate projects. So it's an administrative move. This whole series should look pretty familiar. What this is per the City Council work session. It's just looking for your authority to actually appropriate all of those one-time capital projects from the one-time funding in the capital outlay fund. These are the other sides of the entries I was referring to on that first page. The transfer, these are all the transfers out of the miscellaneous grants funds for the rental housing mediation program and for all of the police department reimbursements to the general fund for the miscellaneous grants. This is also a library request. And what this is that after the development of the fiscal year 14 budget, the City of Goleta actually approved its budget. And they identified a contribution from developer fees of about $45,000 to purchase books and materials for the Goleta branch. So this was not an amount that was known by the library at the time of budget development. So this entry will actually increase revenues, estimated revenues, and appropriations for the purchase of books and materials. This is a out of the streets fund, or request for streets funds. It's all Measure A grants in fiscal year 13 were designated to the School Zone Safety Improvement Project. This entry will transfer about $70,000 of available appropriations in the project to the Bicycle Master Plan Update Project just for the city's match. So it represents for the match for the grant received prior to the update.
And where was that grant received from?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but Michelle DeCant should be able to. Oh.
Or Browning Allen?
Yeah, Browning Allen, Transportation Manager, Public Works Department. It was a grant that we received from the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments. It was a Measure A South Coast grant.
Okay. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The last line on the streets fund is a request of an increase in appropriations from reserves. Since the fiscal 14 budget adoption, Public Works has identified additional funding needs for the Lower Mission Creek Flood Control Project. This is as they enter the construction phase. They need additional funds for managing the coordination and funding of certain requirements by the city design review boards. So this is a request from reserves. The next series, I lumped these together to kind of talk about together since it's a...
Sure. Of course.
Okay, $100,000 out of reserves for the Mission Creek Flood Control Department, and yet it's a streets fund.
From the Mission Control Flood Project out of reserves, out of the streets, yes.
Seems odd to me. So it's one of the bridge projects? Is that why it would...
Good afternoon.
Make the bridges
Mr. Chair.
prettier or something like that?
John Owasiak, Principal Civil Engineer for Public Works Department. You've recently seen at Council the agreement between the county flood control and the city with regards to work that's ongoing between the city and the county and coordination of that work. The city's doing the bridge projects, funding and constructing the bridge projects, and the county is funding the reaches in between the bridges. And so this money is for that coordination, which the city is the lead for getting the environmental approvals, and then some of the improvements that come out of those conditions of approval through the discretionary boards. And so we've identified this amount of funding that is the need to have that coordination between the two projects for the group project, which is the Lower Mission Creek Flood Control Project, at which the city and the county are partners in.
It just seems odd that, I appreciate that the bridges have used streets money for their portion of the grants and such like, but $100,000 is going for one of the reaches, which is not a bridge. And so it seems odd to me that streets money would be used for water conveyance rather than
Committee Member White, the project is to convey and have flood protection, as you are well aware of. And so the city is assisting the county with getting their project through the system, through the city review process. And so there are coordination issues that we have. It involves staff time, and it involves some of the public improvements.
The work is there.
But it's
money coming from streets rather than from somewhere else is my question.
Don't know where else it would come from.
Okay.
For that purpose. We've typically had drainage and flood control type protection work be funded out of streets. We've done drainage, multiple drainage improvements to the Laguna Pump Station, and other flood control projects that are streets funded in our 6-year capital program.
That's new to me. Thank you.
Okay. The next entries that I'm going to talk about together are the Water Operating and Water Capital Fund. Public Works has identified an additional $185,000 of additional needs in the water distribution program in the operating fund to support on-call paving services and additional paving work due to water main breaks. So this request is to transfer these appropriations from the Water Capital Fund in available appropriations from the water main replacement project to the Water Operating Fund, and then appropriate these to the on-call paving services project and program. This next one is in the wastewater capital program. At the end of fiscal year 13, Public Works did have $149,000 of available reserves in the wastewater capital fund. This was due to projects being completed under budget. So Public Works is requesting that to use these available reserves in fiscal year 14 to appropriate to the wastewater lift station rehabilitation project for the planning and design of a new force main construction project. This will assist with the sewer lift stations. The next several entries, these two as well as the two on the next page related to airport, these are all a reprogramming of available appropriations to increase appropriations for existing projects. Available appropriations are from either completed projects or projects that are expected to be completed under budget, as well as one project that has been canceled just due to, for many reasons, they don't expect that they will be able to complete the project. And so the airport has identified 3 projects that either 2 of them are ongoing, that they feel they need additional appropriations and have additional needs for them. The first one is the lessee building maintenance projects. That's several needs for going out and maintaining all of their lessee buildings. The other one is the AOA pavement maintenance project. The one on the next page, it's about $5,000. I'll touch on it in a minute. It's already completed. It just had $5,000 that went over budget. So these are all entries that they went through and analyzed their projects and identified projects that had additional available and additional appropriations. And that's that top one, that $5,000 that I was just referring to. The last entry I can talk about together, the $207,000 in the airport capital, as well as the airport grants right there. What this is that the airport fund often will go out of the capital fund, will pay for design costs for a grant that they're applying for. They'll pay for it out of the capital fund. This is pretty common, I'm sure you're aware. And they'll apply for a grant, and they may or may not get approved for the grants. It could be several years later. Well, in this case, they did get approved for the grant, and so now they will be reimbursing the capital fund for the design costs that were expended out of the capital fund. So this entry will reimburse the capital fund, and they're also requesting to appropriate the funds in the capital fund for the same project. And that's all of the entries. Any questions?
Okay. I think we're caught up.
All right, thank you. Oh, I can't see it. I'm sorry. Oh.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Mr. White, might I have a motion?
Well, I move that the Finance Committee recommend to full council that we approve the proposed mid-year adjustments and accept the fiscal year interim financial statements.
Beautifully phrased. I second that motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Carries.
Good afternoon again, Chair Francisco, Committee Member White. We have before you today the banking services agreement renewal or new contract with Union Bank. So I'd like to do a brief overview of the history of the bank and Santa Barbara Bank and Trust prior to getting to this point with the bank conversion, and where we're going with this for the next year. Okay. A little bit of history of banking services. The city previously banked with Santa Barbara Bank and Trust basically since 1990. They provided all banking services to include armored car, lockbox, bank wires, cash vault, online banking, check processing, and etc. These services are valued at an average of about $12,000 a month, and that's been for the last several years at that level. The fees for these services are provided via a monthly analysis statement by the bank. They essentially analyze all our activity, calculate the fees, and as I mentioned, those fees range in the $12,000 range on a monthly basis. The compensation to the bank for our fees are done by maintaining what we call a compensating balance with the bank. So at the moment that the bank compensating balance is, I believe, at $4.3 million. And in effect, we maintain that balance with the bank, and we earn interest or an interest earnings allowance with the bank that then is used to offset the fees that the bank would normally charge us. Those interest earnings range in about $2,500 a month. So in effect, once the bank calculates their fees, applies an earnings credit, the hard dollar cost of the fees would be about $9,500 per month. At this time, those fees are waived each month under an existing agreement that was entered into with Santa Barbara Bank and Trust, and then later adopted or carried forward with Union Bank. The hard dollar costs are rather significant, and in part that's due to the declining interest rate on that earnings allowance. Years ago, those interest rates were much higher. Mm-hmm. So in effect, the city could offset all banking fees by interest earnings based on balances kept with the bank. And that was a pretty normal structure. With the decline in interest earnings, those hard dollar costs became greater and greater. So with the transition to Union Bank, back in December 1st, 2013, Santa Barbara Bank and Trust officially became part of Union Bank. In April of 2013, Union Bank converted and we fully implemented the use of Union Bank to include checks, online banking, etc. The Union Bank contract adopted by Santa Barbara Bank and Trust was set to expire in December 2013. In November, the City Council authorized an extension to that contract to February 2014. Same terms and conditions applied, and there were no fees charged to the city for that period in time. Since that contract is expiring at the end of this month, city staff negotiated with the bank a new 10-month term contract through the end of December 2014. What that does is provide us the same level of services for a total cost of $78,000 for the remainder of this calendar year. It provides for a waiver of all fees for the month of March and April, a waiver of all transportation fees for courier services and armored car services through December 2014. And the monthly cost for the months of May through December would then be $9,750 a month. They've provided the city with a compensating balance interest earning rate of 0.4%. The current rate with the Santa Barbara Bank and Trust agreement was at 0.63%. That interest rate actually is much higher than they would normally offer. The LAIF rate right now is ranging in the 0.24% range. So they did extend us a little bit of a higher interest earnings rate. So based on what we estimate, maintaining a $20 million compensating balance with the bank, since that interest rate would be higher than what we would earn with LAIF, we could generate $6,700 in interest earnings or interest earnings allowance in a month. That would provide the city with a net hard dollar cost of approximately $3,000. We would anticipate allocating those costs to the various funds and departments that use the services for banking services, similar to what we do now with interest earnings. We do allocate finance costs as well on a reimbursement basis to all the departments. So we estimate that the general fund impact for this fiscal year would be in the $2,000 range for those hard dollar costs. Again, we're anticipating that the interest earnings allowance would offset the banking charges for each month. And in FY15, approximately $6,000 impact to the general fund once those costs are allocated to the various departments and funds. We anticipate that we would, again, offset the interest earnings allowance against the fees, the $9,700, and that the balance could then be allocated either against interest or recorded as an expenditure, again, spread to the various departments that use banking services. So what we would anticipate in this coming year, or this next year, prior to the expiration of the next agreement, well in advance, actually, in advance of the banking agreement that's before you, we would evaluate all the banking services for efficiency, cost savings opportunities. We just underwent a significant financial software upgrade. The bank offers some extensive online banking services. So we would look at any opportunity we have to shave those costs down, those monthly costs down. We would also look to evaluate the satisfaction with services provided by Union Bank and their ability to meet our needs. In that, we could renegotiate and extend an agreement with Union Bank based on our analysis and evaluation of their services, or we could consider a request for a proposal. And the time frame for that would be likely making some decision to either move forward with renegotiation or a request for proposal by the end of the fiscal year, June 30, 2014. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell, and I'm available for any questions.
Mr. White.
Thank you. So I'm getting a little clearer picture. Right now, even at these super low rates, at the 0.4%, that's kind of a wash with the $20 million that's deposited with Union Bank. Then the fees and the interest that the city gains from that is very close to being a wash. Is that correct? It's
close. You basically you're earning interest, but the banks take the fees. Offsetting the fees. Right.
And then if we were to go back pre-crash, what would the rate of interest be on those?
Some of those rates were in the 5% range, 6% range, believe it or not. I think the last schedule I looked at, the early 2000s, I think were in the 5% range. So it was very common for banks to negotiate with cities to maintain a balance of funds, and the funds didn't have to be that significant to pay for the fees, and it was just how it was done.
And that would have been the city's, when you weren't here, I appreciate that that's before your time, but that was the city strategy in those days. Okay. because that obviously is a much bigger number. You'd have 5% of $20 million, and that's
You wouldn't have to
that's
even
real
maintain
money.
20%, you get, or 20 million.
$2 million to cover it or
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right.
Okay, but they just look at those numbers and balance them out. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, ladies. Anything else?
A recommendation?
Well, I would move, Mr. Chair, the Finance Committee recommend that Council approve and authorize a banking service agreement with Union Bank through the calendar year 2014.
And I second that motion. All those in favor? Aye.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that makes it feel even more momentous. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Meeting adjourned.